Yes. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first webcast of TurkuazLab. During these programs, we will be discussing polarization through different scholars, experts, and disciplines. Today, our first guest, Jennifer McCoy from Georgia State University, joined us. Welcome, Jennifer. It's very nice to see you again.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here with you.
I would like to start with my first question. As you know that during Trump's presidency, we observed emerging trends labeled as authoritarian democracy or authoritarian populism. And before we were discussing electoral or competitive authoritarianism. So all these concepts and trends are not unique to the United States, but it led to various academic and also media-based discussions. The re-election of Trump would have further damaged democracy, which had been damaged in many other ways. Would you agree that his defeat does assure a quick recovery for democracy, or what is your opinion on this?
Well, unfortunately, no, I would not say it assures a quick recovery. And that is because Trump was actually a symptom of things that were underlying and going on in the United States for quite some time. So the polarization has been growing since the 1990s, at least, and in some ways before that. And the grievances, the underlying grievances that give rise to a populist polarizing leader like Trump are still there, and they have to be addressed, or we'll see another such leader arise. Perhaps he will come back or another one will take his place. So no, I think we have to think about his presidency as symptoms of larger problems, and it's going to take time, especially because the nation is so divided, the people are so divided along these identity lines. And so their political party identity can supersede even their policy position on issues. People may agree on policy positions. In fact, we have seen this. They can agree on policy positions if it doesn't have a label, Republican or Democrat. But once it has a label, then they will oppose it if it's sponsored or known as a policy of the opposing camp because of their identity and because we have this kind of tribal dynamic. And that's what in my work with Murat Somer, we have called pernicious polarization. And so that is still ongoing, and we have to address that. And similarly in other countries, just getting rid of a populist leader or a polarizing figure alone is not sufficient to guarantee that democracy will be revitalized or that polarization will disappear.
So since you mentioned about the division among people with their identities, actually I have another relevant question. I think we encounter with similar results in different research, but also according to a study which is published by Pew Research Center, the ideological divide among American voters has grown wider over the years, seen as divides inherent to party politics, polarization, or distance as such seem to be an indicator displaying how the preferences of American voters have shifted, especially when the ideological differences pertaining to cities and small towns or centers and peripheries are taken into account. So we believe that affective polarization and the way it portrays itself in social spaces should be studied in the same measure as political or, let's say, ideological polarizations. What would you think?
Definitely. I think that's a really key variable, this kind of so what we call affective polarization is how people feel, their affect. And this is tied to the identity question I mentioned previously. When people begin to really identify with one political camp strongly, and when there are other identities, it might be their religious identity, it might be the place. Place is very important, as you said, urban versus rural contexts, the space where people live. then when these kinds of identities align, it might be racial or ethnic as well. When they align, then it even reinforces the affective polarization, which means people begin to distrust and dislike people from the other side. They carry biases and stereotypes. They tend to generalize, oh, everyone from that party thinks like this, or has this characteristic, or is rich, or is poor, or is lazy, or is unpatriotic. They apply generalizations. And this is what makes it so hard to overcome. And I would say in the United States, it's not necessarily that citizens are getting more extreme in their views, their ideological views, but we've seen this sorting into political parties so that the identities are lining up. And so, yes, the Republican Party tends to have more rural people. Rural people tend to go more towards the Republican Party. White, Christian, heterosexual people tend to go more toward the Republican Party, and Democrats are heavily based in urban areas, more diverse populations, is more multiracial, multicultural, multi-religious. So yes, we can see it looks like a bigger divide on issues like gun rights that might divide especially urban and rural people. But on other issues, we've seen like great support for a higher minimum wage, or for allowing people who are felons who have been convicted of crimes and have paid, their punishment. Great support across the parties that they should be allowed to vote. Yet the political party positions really differ on those, even though the people agree. So it's a little bit mixed. And so this affective polarization is a very important part, because that's how we feel, how we see. And if we see things that aren't true, if our perceptions aren't based in fact, then it's going to be harder for us to trust the other side, leaders and voters from the other side.
Currently, maybe this can be another factor to think on this identity and maybe affective polarization. Currently, we are all experiencing extraordinary conditions due to COVID-19. So having to deal with a common emergency such as the pandemic had been expected to bring identities and social spaces closer. Would you say the output of the pandemic so far has proved the opposite? I mean, widening the gap between developed and underdeveloped countries, or the divide between those privileged enough to be vaccinated and those who cannot? Pandemic seems to prove the notions anticipating a more equal and democratic future role. Would you agree? If so, would this cause further polarizations? I mean, actually, in other words, I want to ask that, should we expect more risks in terms of polarization?
Definitely. You're right that crises or external threats can be a solution to polarization. It can bring people together. So a war, an external enemy, in the United States, the terrorist attack in 2001, 9/11, those kinds of things can bring people together. And a pandemic, certainly an external threat coming from an organism, from biology, we would have expected to bring people together. But unfortunately, in some countries, and in the United States is a prime example, leaders used it for political purposes and politicized the issue. And the Trump administration did that and divided people about it. And so actually created more polarization around it, and it became political. Public health measures like wearing a mask became a political symbol to use for one, vision or one ideology versus another. And you mentioned between countries, and this is a problem. This would have been a time for the world to come together. And indeed, at the scientific level, they did. There was a lot of sharing of information, of knowledge, of testing among scientists. But unfortunately, because of populists who were also strong nationalists, particularly in the United States, but in other countries as well, in England, we see in other countries in Europe, in Turkey. We see people are, those leaders were emphasizing their own nation's interests, which is not surprising. I mean, a leader needs to protect their own country's interests, but we needed to come together much more. And we had already, particularly through the Trump administration, the US had been giving up its global leadership on efforts, global efforts like this, had already been withdrawing from other kinds of international agreements, and then wanted to withdraw from the World Health Organization at the time when we needed to support it to address this. And so you had people kind of going on their own without coordination. And now we're at the point where less developed or poorer countries without access to their own vaccines have to depend on others for their vaccines. And it's a scramble. There's not sufficient international coordination. So instead, it's kind of first come, first all. The strongest is going to get the resources first, when really we're all in this together. And we should be coordinating, because even if here in the United States, if we all get vaccinated at some point, if we've left out the rest of the world, we're going to have people traveling back and forth. We're not a closed society. And so our interests are that everybody is vaccinated. So yes, we see polarization around the issue now. I still have hopes that enough people will come together, enough countries, enough leaders, to coordinate this and to make sure, especially that poorer countries can get access to the vaccine as well.
So you said that politicians use different purposes. They have different agendas and purposes, or maybe we can say that they have different tactics for mobilization. Here, actually, I want to focus on populist leaders more, because depending on their political agenda, populist leaders tend to use a rhetoric targeting, or maybe we can say excluding immigrants, opposition, media, women, or other marginalized identities, which is on occasion fed with a vocabulary that polarizes different religions or identities against each other. What would be the ways to struggle against such a rhetoric?
I think there are 4 things we can do to try to mitigate polarization, really, which includes the rhetoric. So first, the rhetoric on anti-immigrants or any specific people. Populists in particular depend on a polarizing strategy. Their political strategy is to create an us versus them. And it's usually something about the virtuous people versus some kind of an enemy that comes from an elite. But that elite can be defined as the political establishment, that is the traditional political parties. It can be the economic elite. It can be foreign actors, foreign elites, and even anyone who encourages immigration as foreigners coming in and kind of diluting the culture. And so they focus on identifying kind of an amorphous definition of the people that they're going to represent, but it depends on how they define the people. And is that only one group within a society? Is it only the people who speak one particular language or hold one particular religion or one particular race or have ancestry? Or is it more inclusive? Is it based on civic values, constitutional values, the ideas of citizenship? And so populists will tend to focus on their own definition of the people, which may be an exclusionary definition. So those who are anti-immigrant usually take an exclusionary vision of populism rather than an inclusionary vision. An inclusionary vision might be a little bit more economic oriented, trying to be inclusive in the distribution of national wealth and resources. And so what we see, those who want to fight against that rhetoric in particular need to focus on the inclusive values and not speak in terms of enemies and not speak in personal terms. And so if they try to counter a populist rhetoric that identifies some group as an enemy, and they identify that populist leader in insulting or demonizing terms, then they're just feeding into this polarizing rhetoric. And that's what we need to avoid. We don't want to make it deeper. So we don't want to reciprocate it, but instead to have a more positive image. You can argue against ideas without demonizing the people who hold the ideas or their identities. And that's what a more positive combating of populist rhetoric would do. And as well, often populists use emotional appeals, appealing to anger, fear, but especially resentment. And so a counter strategy can also appeal more to hope, to optimism, and presenting a positive message. What are you going to do to actually help people instead of trying to rile up their resentment and their anger?
So I want to continue with more solutions and more positive things, or maybe we can define them as hope. In your opinion, how do the positive advancements we see in countries having female leaders, such as the Prime Minister of the New Zealand or the Marine, who is the Prime Minister of Finland, communicate with the rest of the world?
Yes, I think that it's very interesting that with the number of female leaders, and there have been some, studies showing that countries with female leaders seem to do pretty well with the pandemic, and people were asking, why is that? And I think we can look at many of these female leaders as being very much problem solvers. They're focused on solving problems, and they don't, they can multitask and really take pragmatic approaches to looking at problems and trying to coordinate to solve them. And so I think that's a positive thing we can learn from these leaders. And if that can be extended, if they can extend that globally to this kind of pragmatic cooperation, then that would be very positive for the world.
I have one, maybe you can say it's a difficult question, but I know that you are thinking on this question as well. So as different studies demonstrate, these strategies populist leaders utilize, not only in the United States, but all over the world to come to power and also to stay in power, causes substantial damage for democracies, or maybe we can highlight that they may harm democracies substantially. In this sense, what could be a strategy to mitigate or overcome polarization?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'd say there are 4 or 5 things to think about. One is polarization is actually simplifying politics. And so it's dividing people into 2 camps along a line, and it's simplifying. So it's putting everything, these identities together over here on this side versus this side, and then the issues, the perspectives, the attitudes. And so if we simplify politics in this way and divide everything like that into just 2 camps, it might be 2 political parties like in the United States, or it might be coalitions, or those who are for one leader versus all of those in the opposition might be very fragmented, but they have in common being against a leader. So it might be divided like that. What we need to do is to reconnect these cross-cutting ties that have been lost. When we simplify politics, we're erasing what we used to have were cross-cutting ties. And that's where we can identify with people on different dimensions of identities and of life. And when we have separated ourselves, we have lost our ability to connect, to empathize, to understand. And it's very easy then to get suspicious of someone else's motives when we don't even communicate with them anymore, or to believe some kind of malicious intent that a political leader is saying when they're demonizing and trying to blame and scapegoat the other side. So reforming those cross-cutting ties is crucial, and that can be done at the grassroots level, at the level of citizens in society. That doesn't depend on politics. Citizens can start to do that. They can form together with their neighbors to, create a neighborhood park or deal with a common problem they have. And a second thing would be, I think, for leaders to look to remind citizens, non-polarizing leaders, of universal values. This is what we all stand for. You know, we all want our families safe. We all want our children educated. We all want, you know, well-being and health. And so to focus on the universal values instead of divisive values. But a third thing, the crucial thing is when, as I said before, just getting rid of the top polarizing figure, whether they're populist or some other kind of polarizing figure, doesn't mean that everything that underlies that is going to magically disappear. And so new leaders coming in must address the underlying grievances that gave rise to people being receptive to that polarizing message from the beginning. And so we need to address what are the, you know, can we address health inequities, racial inequities, religious inequities, unemployment, economic concerns. So that would be the third thing. If necessary, we might need to actually repolarize, something that Somer and I have called transformative repolarization. Our idea there is to create a new axis or dividing line, but around social justice, racial justice, or democracy, against injustice or authoritarianism on the other side. But it's risky. You have to be careful because it is repolarizing. It's shifting the axis from, say, anti-immigrant or anti-EU versus, you know, the national interest as a dividing line, but it's shifting it around these values. And so you can't demonize, you can't create identities or blaming other people, but focus on the values. That's tied to addressing those underlying grievances, particularly if there is a major historic injustice, like racial inequities, ethnic inequities, religious inequities, then this may be necessary. I would say that's what we're facing in the United States today. We have spent 200 years without resolving the racial inequities from the founding of our country that excluded African Americans from through our slavery system, and Native American Indians were excluded. And until we address that historic systemic racism, we will continue to have polarizing issues raise themselves every few decades in the United States.
Thanks for your all answers. You explained everything in a very comprehensive sense. It was very nice to hear from you, and to be honest, it was very nice to see you again. Thanks for accepting our invitation.
Thank you so much, Tuğçe. I enjoyed it.
Today we are concluding our first webcast program, but I should emphasize that we will continue with new guests and new discussions. So please stay safe and healthy.